Hello and good afternoon to everyone. I would like to welcome you and thank you for joining our International Human Rights and Criminal Justice Summer School Law on the Bosphorus, which is organized annually by the Istanbul University Faculty of Law in collaboration with Leiden Law School. The focus of 2020 Bosphorus School will be on the relationship between human rights and criminal law during Covid-19 pandemic. We all know Covid-19 pandemic is still spreading all over the world, also the lockdowns and some of the restrictions in everywhere. Because of these, the courts and the jails and in general terms, criminal justice systems face with new challenges. Perhaps today I turn straight away Kanita Prušĉanović, who is PhD candidate, research associate in University of Sarejova. In her presentation, she will provide us information on impacts of COVID-19 on criminal law and criminal justice system in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Dear Prušĉanović, if you are ready, the stage is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Merve. Hello, everyone. As you already heard, I work as a research associate at the Chair of Criminal Law at the Faculty of Law, University of Sarajevo, and it's really my great pleasure to be one of the lecturers at this international summer school. As we all already know, we are passing through a challenging time of COVID-19 pandemic, and it left no of the area of the law unaffected. So it is also the case with the criminal law. Today, I would like to inform you about the recent developments in the area of the criminal justice system and criminal law. My today's topic is impacts of COVID-19 pandemic on criminal law and criminal justice system in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As we already all understood, it is a great challenging time, and we've really left no area of the light unaffected, and so it is with the criminal law. And particularly the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a smaller Western Balkan country, is even more harder because we have many challenges even before the pandemic, and now it is even greater challenge to keep all of the justice system and criminal law moving on. So I will first like to introduce you the structure of my presentation. Firstly, we will look at the outbreak of COVID-19 in Bosnia and Herzegovina and pandemic management. Then we will move on the impact of COVID-19 on the functioning of judicial system in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And then afterwards, we will consider the criminal offenses against health in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I will try to highlight just the most important points of these criminal offenses, which are so frequently committed during the time of ongoing pandemic. And finally, I would like to address the problem of corruption in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the pandemic time by questioning whether COVID-19 pandemic in Bosnia and Herzegovina equals to pandemic of corruption in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So let me start by telling you when did we register our first case in Bosnia and Herzegovina in this ongoing pandemic. It happened on 5th March 2020, when health officials from Banja Luka, Republika Srpska, confirmed the first case of COVID-19 infection. As you all know, COVID-19 pandemic is a fast-moving challenge. So in the next days, we already registered more cases. It was 3 more cases in Republika Srpska, and then we had our first case in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina as another entity in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We needed to undertake the measures. The first of the measures was to close the school and higher education institutions, and then was followed by the decisions of bigger priority, such as forbidding entrance in Bosnia and Herzegovina for foreign nationals coming from areas with intensive transmission of viruses. Actually, we looked at the experience of the other countries. We saw that there's a great risk from the foreign nationals coming into the country because there were the countries where there was more intensive transmission of the virus. And then afterwards, on 17th March 2020, we declared a nation-wide state of emergency in order to enable coordination of emergency activities between the entities in Bosnia and Herzegovina. As you all know, Bosnia and Herzegovina already has a complex state structure, and it is even a bigger challenge to coordinate the activities during this kind of emergency situations, such as ongoing epidemic is. One of the first measures, which is directly related with pandemic, was issuing of self-isolation orders for citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina coming back to the country. It was one of the measures in order to prevent the spread of the infections, and afterwards, when there were many cases, it was followed by establishing of quarantines in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The first time of dealing with the pandemic was quite restricted because on 21st March 2020, we introduced a curfew for the entire Bosnia and Herzegovina, and it was in force until 24th April in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Republika Srpska until 22nd May. Afterwards, on 24th March 2020, Council of Ministers issued a decision which bans entrance for all foreigners, and from 30th March on, all of the borders at the airports were closed for the passengers. At the first time of COVID-19 pandemic, we actually succeeded in keeping the low rate of infections. As of 31st March 2020, we had 413 infected persons confirmed and 12 deaths, while in the next month, until 30th April, there were 1,757 confirmed cases and 68 deaths. Of course, even though the first time of pandemic management was restrictive, we needed to continue with our lives. So when it was seen that the infection rate is low, we started to gradually introduce the confinement measure, and we also resigned the state of emergency. Later, in the continuance of this pandemic, as of end of June, Bosnia and Herzegovina has seen a recent resurgence of infections, with the number of positive cases increasing within the entire territory of Bosnia and Herzegovina. We then had 4,453 confirmed cases and 185 deaths. Then, as a response to the growing number of COVID-19 positive cases, the Ministry of Health of the Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina declared an epidemic of COVID-19 on 17 July. This is one of the measures which does not directly concern the population, but it implies more operative actions such as stricter central control at border crossings, all in order to prevent the spread of COVID-19. So what is today's situation in regard to coronavirus pandemic in Bosnia and Herzegovina? As of 17th August 2020, so yesterday, we had 16,111 cases, from which there is 486 number of deaths, and the people recovered, the number is on 9,856. I would like now to move to the bigger and more important part of my presentation, which is focused solely on the criminal law and criminal justice system in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the time of the pandemic. So one of the challenges was to keep the judicial system moving, even though there is an ongoing pandemic. First in line to react was, of course, a High Judicial and Prosecutorial Council in regard of judiciary. And on 22nd March 2020, they adopted a decision on the organization of work processes in courts and prosecutors' offices in Bosnia and Herzegovina. The significance of it is that they decided that the main hearings in criminal matters are to be postponed, except in cases in which detention has been ordered or sought, where there is a risk of statute of limitations expiring, and in other urgent cases as set forth in criminal codes in Bosnia and Herzegovina. In regard to minor offense cases, it was decided they are to be postponed, except in cases of non-compliance with the decisions and orders issued by the competent authorities during the COVID-19 pandemic. And actually, this is the place where we can begin looking at the recent developments in regard to weathering COVID-19 pandemic in Bosnia and Herzegovina in the area of criminal law. Of course, this was a decision which decided how to react in the first time of the pandemic, but then more of the discussions were opened, which questioned whether there was a time to introduce online trials, because the problem was that most of the cases were delayed, and we actually wanted to resume all of the criminal cases in the quickest time. So in April, High Judicial and Prosecutorial Council of Bosnia and Herzegovina adopted the initiative for amendments to the Criminal Procedure Code in order to enable the conduct of online trials when there is a health risk for participants in the proceedings. So it was the biggest development, since it concerned that the situation is so that we don't know how long it will last, but we have an ongoing trials that need to be resumed. It was actually an attempt to try to use all of the digital technologies in order to continue with delivering the justice. So it is also named as a delivering of virtual justice. And of course, it was questionable whether it was possible or not in Bosnia and Herzegovina, since we have so many complex structures throughout the country. The problem was that it required a revision of 4 criminal procedure codes on all levels. And unfortunately, up to the day, only Brčko district, so only one part of Bosnia and Herzegovina, adopted the amendment of criminal procedure code, which means that only in one part of Bosnia and Herzegovina we have a legal basis to introduce this kind of online trials and to keep the justice system moving on. Fortunately, later on, after this discussion on the topic of online trials, the situation was so that High Judicial and Prosecutorial Council decided that organization of work and courts in prosecutors' offices is aligned with decisions of crisis headquarters and other competent authorities. So later on, after easing of restrictions imposed due to COVID-19, High Judicial and Prosecutorial Councils has decided that hearings can only be held in courtrooms where an adequate physical distance between all the defendants can be assured. So the problem was that we had a decision which said that we can continue with the trials, but not all the trials, but just the ones when there is, I think, up to 5 defendants in the case. And also they can be continued just in the courtrooms where there can be an adequate physical distance. So another question which emerged was a problem of large-scale Bosnian war trials. As you all know, we had a war in Bosnia and Herzegovina from 1992 to 1995, and unfortunately, there are still many cases of war crimes which are not processed. It was even more questioned whether we will succeed in holding to a deadline which is set in the revised National War Crime Processing Strategy set for end of 2023. And it was thought that maybe online trials can be a way to ensure the continued processing of war crimes. But the question was whether it was feasible or not. On the one side, we have the rights of the defendants, which need to be secured. On the other side, we also have now delay in the delivering of the justice. So it is still ongoing debate whether we will try to have such a system of online trials in this kind of emergency system or not. It is yet to be seen. Now I will move on the criminal offenses against health in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where I would like to highlight that I will not show you all of the legal and penal framework of criminal offenses against health in Bosnia and Herzegovina, but just the ones which are most frequently committed during the time of pandemics. So, as the utmost priority is the efficient detection and prosecution of all criminal offenses that could endanger the health and safety of citizens, and are linked with the prevention of and protection from the spreading of the COVID-19 as priority. And actually, in this part, I'm going to question whether it is so in the reality. So, to which extent is it so in the reality of Bosnia and Herzegovina? As I already said, those were only theoretical things, and now I would like to move to the real criminal cases which are going on. The first one is Iguankoni's case, and it was actually an event of celebrating 70th anniversary of Arms Factory on 15th March, which was attended by a guest from Serbia who tested positive for the COVID-19 after the ceremony. So, as you can already understand, there was one ceremony which was held despite of the recommendations on avoiding mass indoor gatherings. You can see the dates, 15th March. So there was still no ban on mass indoor gatherings, but there was a recommendation to avoid mass indoor gatherings. Despite it, it was decided that this celebration is going to be held. And unfortunately, after this big celebration, which was attended by more than 200 guests, it was confirmed that one of the guests from Serbia was tested positive for the coronavirus. We needed to react to this situation, which was unprecedented. We didn't know how to react. So the first measure introduced was issuing of self-isolation orders for all of the people which attended the ceremony. So we can now consider it was more than 200 people. They were from various cities around Bosnia and Herzegovina, and there was a real danger of spreading the coronavirus in Bosnia and Herzegovina. We needed to wait for a period of time in order to see whether there would be more infections or not. Unfortunately, this became one of the first clusters responsible for bigger spreading of COVID-19 in countries. We still don't have the real numbers of on this cluster, but it is estimated that there are more than 30 people infected, and unfortunately, there are also death cases from this cluster. So on 24th March 2020, we had a first death case from this cluster. It was the driver of the director of the company, and another case is the wife of the director of the company. So after it was publicly released that this kind of event was held despite of recommendations, and that it resulted really in a real transmission of infection. There was public anger growing because it was told that someone needs to be responsible for holding this kind of event in the time of the pandemic. Bosnia State Prosecutor's Office formed a case, and it is yet to be seen how will this case end, and will it end in an indictment against someone who is criminally responsible for organizing this kind of event in time of pandemic. The second case, which really calls not just the interest of the public, but the public anger, was the case of Iguankoni. And it was the first case where it was shown that our health system cannot cope with the burden of the pandemic, or at the beginning of the pandemic, we were not ready for all the challenges which were waiting up. So it was the case where one 52-year-old woman from the Sarajevo suburb of Krasnica had serious symptoms of coronavirus infection for more than a week. She was trying to reach the doctors, and she was going to a local clinic, but unfortunately they were always telling the first question: did you go to some of the countries where there is high transmission of the virus, or did you go abroad at all? Since she was not going abroad, they said, oh, you don't have coronavirus, we won't test you. Actually, the background information is that in that time, we still didn't have enough tests in Bosnia and Herzegovina in order to test all the people who were potentially infected with coronavirus. Unfortunately, as the days were passing, her health situation was becoming even harder. And on the last day, unfortunately, this woman passed away. Her daughter insisted that local clinics sent a vehicle, since that morning she stood blue around her mouth and on the hands and the feet. And she understood that the infection, whatever it is, if it is something other than coronavirus or coronavirus, the situation is really a severe one. They sent from a local medical clinic, they sent a vehicle, but which had no medical staff. So when a vehicle arrived, the woman was taken there, and unfortunately, on the way to hospital, this woman passed away. And then afterwards, a post-mortem test was done, and it confirmed COVID-19 infection. So days prior to the death of this woman, she was insisting on getting a test. They were rejecting her to be tested, and unfortunately, it ended with the death of this woman. And then another problem emerged. When this woman died, of course, family and also the prosecution office, which was already informed by some information that there is such a case going on, they insisted on an autopsy. And the problem was that autopsies were not performed in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So even though we had such a case, no court medicine specialist in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina wanted to perform this autopsy because they said they don't have special chambers for performing such kind of autopsy. They also said they don't have enough protection or which they need for performing such as high-risk autopsies. There were discussions whether this virus is still alive in the body of that person or so on. The World Health Organization said that there is no bigger risk with this autopsies when they are performed in a way to prevent the spread of the virus if there is possibility of spreading it there. Unfortunately, the body of this woman waited 2 months in order to perform an abduction, and it was performed in Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina after the period of 2 months. You know, it's a great question whether it is an autopsy which can prove us what happens in this case. Is this the result of the failure of the health system? Who has responsibility here? Because in criminal justice system, there's great importance of timely and adequately performed autopsy. Since we know that it's autopsy which was performed 2 months after the death, we don't know in how far will it show what actually happened in this case, and will it lead to some results which are valuable to us. Cantonal Prosecutor's Office formed the case, so as I already said, autopsy was conducted, and the results of the autopsy are still not being publicly disclosed. So these were 2 cases which really drew the attention of the public in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and they so-called marked the beginning of pandemics in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we questioned in which extent are we ready to weather the pandemic in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Now I would like to show you the legal and penal frameworks of the most frequently committed crimes in Bosnia and Herzegovina during the pandemic. So as you all know, this group of crimes was not so known before the time of the pandemic, and then we had a challenge to proceed all of the socially irresponsible behaviors which were present during the pandemic. So I will show you just the provisions of the Criminal Code of Federation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in order to show you that we have a legal framework and penal framework which is satisfactory. We just need to apply these codes. So the first one is transmission of contagious disease. Then I will explain the non-compliance with health regulations during an epidemic. Then we will move on to serious criminal offenses against people's health. The first one is transmission of a contagious disease. And as we can see, the crime is whoever fails to comply with regulations or ordinances whereby a competent healthcare body orders measures for the suppression or prevention of a contagious disease with people, and where consequently a danger of spreading of a contagious disease occurs, shall be punished by imprisonment for a term not exceeding 1 year. For this crime, when it is perpetrated out of negligence, it shall be punished by a fine or imprisonment for a term not exceeding 6 months. So we can see the penal framework, and we see the elements of crime. So this failure to comply with regulations, and there needs to occur a danger of spreading the disease. Another crime which is very frequent, and we can relate it to already mentioned self-isolation orders. Even breach of self-isolation order can constitute this crime, is non-compliance with health regulations during an epidemic. And it is stated that whoever at the time of an epidemic of a contagious disease fails to comply with ordinances and decisions passed on the basis of regulations of competent body, which regulations establish measures for the suppression or prevention of the epidemic, shall be punished by imprisonment for a term not exceeding 1 year. So we can see the penal framework here. And we have yet the serious criminal offenses against people's health, where we can see even bigger penal framework. So Let me start by showing you the first paragraph. It is prescribed that if by the criminal offense against people's health specified in the criminal code, a serious bodily injury is inflicted upon a person, or a person's health is severely impaired, or the existing illness is aggravated, the perpetrator shall be punished by imprisonment for a term between 1 and 8 years. So we see there's even a bigger penalty prescribed for this. And in second paragraph, we have if by the criminal offense against people's health specified in the criminal code, the death of one or more persons is caused, the perpetrator shall be punished by imprisonment for a term between 1 and 12 years. So we see penal framework here. Paragraph 3, it is for the criminal offenses perpetrated against people's health specified in the criminal code, perpetrated out of negligence, and when there is a serious bodily injury inflicted upon a person, or a person's health is severely impaired, or the existing illness is aggravated, the perpetrator shall be punished by imprisonment for a term between 6 months and 5 years. We have still one paragraph which says if by the criminal offenses against people's health specified in the criminal code perpetrated out of negligence, the death of one or more persons is caused, the perpetrator shall be punished by imprisonment for a term between 1 and 8 years. So I think that I probably now succeeded to show you our legal and penal framework for the crimes which are really frequently committed during the pandemic, and we can also see the importance of the cases mentioned. So we have the first case, Iguankoni, which really resulted with the spread of coronavirus in Bosnia and Herzegovina. It is still being processed by the state prosecutor's offices. It is even more questionable will it end in indictment or not, but it really caused peptic anger, and it really resulted in such a spread of disease in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So someone needs to be held criminally liable for this. And also in the case of Asiye Kanita, we saw in how far we have very heavy consequences of our health system, which was not organized in order to cope with the burden of the pandemic going on. Now I will move to the practical dilemma which also occurred during the pandemic, and it was whether violation of prohibition and restriction of movement constitutes criminal offense or minor offense. It is still an open question. Some of the legal professionals think that it's a criminal offense. Some of them think that there is a minor offense. It was in this time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it was assessed as minor offense mostly. But it is an open question. There are grounds on both sides. For the cases generally of the criminal offenses against people's health, which are adjudicated so far, we had fines or monetary penalties and probation sentences. So we see what are the results of the first cases of criminal offenses against people's health, and we hope that it's yet to be seen the outcome of the proceedings which are going on. Now I will move to maybe the most interesting part of my presentation, which considers the comprehensive challenge of corruption in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So even before the pandemic, as smaller country, we had a real threat to a rule of law in the corruption. And unfortunately, in the time of the pandemic, it became even bigger. This questioning whether COVID-19 pandemic equals the pandemic of corruption in Bosnia and Herzegovina was one of the questions raised by our High Representative when he was addressing the Security Council of the UN with his semi-annual report. And he said that we managed to keep the disease on the low rate, but on the other side, we have a big pandemic called corruption in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So what actually constitutes a risk for the corruption in this kind of emergency situation? We all know that management of international financial and material assistance, as well as public procurements in health sector, increase this risk. And the problem is that even up to now, for a small country of Bosnia and Herzegovina, there was many financial and material assistance, but not always it was used for the aims that it needed to be. Unfortunately, we also needed to act in the time of pandemic in order to enable these public procurements to be done in a quicker way. So on 17th March 2020, the Public Procurement Agency of Bosnia and Herzegovina has issued an official notice stating that in situations of extreme emergency, when it is not possible to apply regular public procurement procedures, it is possible to apply a negotiated procedure without prior publication. So it opened a space for, of course, some of the processes that to be ongoing, even though that there is pandemic, and for faster way to do the procurement, but also it opened a gap for many of the conducts which are suspicious and which can constitute crimes, and we will see in which cases did it result in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So how was it prescribed? It was prescribed that conditions stipulated in official notice in this situation must have clear and objective reasons for emergency action. They must have extreme emergency conditions caused by events that could not have been anticipated by the contracting authority. And also occurrence of such circumstances must be outside of the control of contracting party, so extremely prompt reaction of contracting authority is required in regard to public procurement aiming to prevent, decrease, and stop harmful effects. So this was a situation, so legal basis of affairs which occurred in Bosnia and Herzegovina, unfortunately. They emerged during the pandemic and they caused a big public anger. As we are a small state, we were not ready for weathering this pandemic in terms of our healthcare system. Unfortunately, we know that every 1 in 6 persons infected with COVID-19 would require medical treatment with respirator, also called medical ventilator. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, we didn't have enough respirators. So it was decided that we need to acquire these respirators by the public procurement in the time of the pandemic, and it unfortunately resulted in a political scandal, which is now a criminal case. So it is so-called Respirators Affair, which represents a public procurement scandal of acquiring 100 medical respirators for intensive care units from the agricultural company, which is called Silver Raspberry, for 5.3 million euros. So as we already saw, the company which was acquiring these respirators was primarily agricultural company, which had no experience in medical equipment. Despite of it, the public procurement was conducted with this firm, and it was conducted by the Federal Department for Civilian Protection as a unit within the federal government, for the scandal to be even bigger. And the suspended suspects in this case are the prime ministers of the entity government, by the knowledge, and suspended director of the Federal Department for Civilian Protection, and owner of Silver Raspberry, Fikret Hotić. So we had a case when we really had a need for these ventilators, but unfortunately it ended up in a scandal since this kind of public procurement was obtained from agricultural company. So the questions which emerged by the days were: did Srebrna Malina, so Silver Raspberry company, have a license for trade and medical equipment? So if they had this license, how did they acquire it, since they were primarily a firm which deals with the raspberries, so the producement and the sale of the raspberries? And the question was, probably the main question was this contract with the government legal? Another affair which was understood in the later on was the thing that we acquired these respirators, so hundreds of medical respirators from an agricultural company, but they do not meet the requirements in order to be used in the intensive care units of Bosnia-Herzegovina. So it was another question. Not just that we bought the respirators from the agricultural company in a suspicious way and unfortunately done by the government of Bosnia-Herzegovina, but these respirators for which the money was given were not usable for the aim they needed to serve. So unfortunately, till today, we don't know are these respirators in a state to be used for urgency care in medical facilities or not. Suspects in this case were arrested and put into custody. However, they were shortly afterwards released by decision of the court with the prohibitive measures. Why I say that we don't know still are these respirators usable or not. The question is because at the beginning of this case, as I already said, prosecutor's office opened the case. They, of course, ordered an expert report to see whether really the respirators met the requirements which they were needed for or not. The first report said that they are not usable for the aim of this urgent medical aid. And another report which emerged later said that they are usable, but the fact is till today these medical respirators are not used in Bosnia and Herzegovina since there is an ongoing procedure, it's ongoing criminal case. So we actually spent money for the respirators, which we don't even know whether we can use them or not for the aim, which was the priority of this public procurement. So this investigation, which was opened by the prosecutor's offices, was for the crimes of associating for the purpose of committing criminal offense, then abuse of office, receiving a reward for trading in influence, money laundering, and forgery or destruction of business documents and trade books. So I will tell you the recent developments till these days. Investigation already determined that Prime Minister had been in the communication with the director of this agricultural company even before the official offer was submitted to the government, and that the government had also guaranteed the payment to the Chinese manufacturer before the contract was concluded. So these all emerged after we actually got information about this affair, but it is yet to be seen how will our prosecution office end this case up, or will it lead to responsibility of the main actors or not? It is yet to be seen. What is important is that we undertake the measures in order to prevent the further cases of prevention, so further cases of possible corruption. There was an agency for prevention of corruption and coordination of the fight against corruption, first in line to react, and they created the action plan for the prevention of corruption in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So it is questionable whether this plan will end up by decreasing the risk of corruption or not. On the other side, we still have other open cases in front of the cantonal prosecutor's offices, so it's yet to be seen how will these cases end up. Finally, I would like to conclude by saying that outbreak of COVID-19 and epidemic management in Bosnia and Herzegovina brought to light the overwhelming issues of lack of transparency and accountability, and that more efforts are needed in order to provide integrated response in this regard. Thank you all for your attention, and I hope that I was clear in my presentation and that I really made for you how is the situation in Bosnia and Herzegovina in regard to.
Thank you very much for an amazing presentation. It was interesting and also informative. I'm sure that every participant in this session and this summer school are interested in what's going on around the world about COVID-19 pandemic situations regarding criminal law apart from their hometown. I think everybody aware of the pandemic has affected and more frankly hit the criminal justice system all around the world.